Some places hold your pain like they're keeping it safe for your return. For Maren Holt, that place was her family's cabin in the Montana mountains, a place she'd sworn never to see again after the night that broke her heart 20 years ago. Now her father was dead, and the cabin belonged to her. Walking through the front door felt like stepping back into her worst memory. The old floorboards creaked the same way. The stone fireplace still smelled of pine smoke and regret. Her dog, Ash, sniffed around the hearth and started digging at the wooden planks. What he found buried there would prove that some family secrets don't stay hidden forever. It was a chest, old and locked tight, filled with things that would explain why her family really fled this mountain. But what deadly truth had been waiting under those floorboards all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maren knelt beside the weathered chest, her hands trembling as she worked the rusted clasps. The metal fought her at first, corroded by decades of mountain moisture, but eventually gave way with a grinding protest that echoed through the empty cabin. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived the years, lay a collection of items that made no immediate sense together. On top sat a faded family photograph, its edges curled and water-stained. Maren lifted it carefully, squinting in the dim afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The image showed her parents, much younger than she remembered them, standing beside two other couples she didn't recognize. Everyone wore the kind of serious expressions people reserved for important occasions, not casual family gatherings. Her mother's hand rested protectively on her father's arm, and there was something in their eyes, a wariness that seemed out of place in what should have been a happy moment. The cabin around her held its breath, as if the walls themselves were listening to her discoveries. This place had been her sanctuary once, back when she was 17 and thought she understood the world. The main room stretched before her, exactly as it had been that terrible night when everything changed. Her father's reading chair still sat by the window, the leather cracked but intact. Her mother's quilting frame remained propped against the far wall, a half-finished pattern of blue and gold squares, waiting for hands that would never return to complete it. Ash settled beside her with a soft whine, his dark eyes fixed on the chest, as if he understood its significance better than she did. The German Shepherd had been her constant companion for the past 5 years, ever since she'd found him half-starved on the side of a highway outside Billings. There was something almost human about his intelligence, the way he seemed to anticipate her moods and needs. Now he watched with the patience of a counselor, offering his quiet presence while she navigated this emotional minefield. 20 years was a long time to carry anger, but Maren had managed it with the dedication of someone who'd made bitterness into an art form. She'd built a life in Denver that deliberately had nothing to do with mountains, wilderness, or the kind of people who chose isolation over civilization. Her apartment overlooked busy streets and coffee shops, places where neighbors were polite, strangers, and no one expected you to share your family. History over morning conversations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become exactly what her mother had always feared, a woman without roots, drifting from one temporary situation to another. 3 different jobs in 5 years, none of them careers so much as ways to fill time and pay rent. 2 relationships that had ended when the men realized she had no intention of sharing the deeper parts of herself. She'd convinced herself this was freedom, but standing in this cabin again, she recognized it for what it truly was, an elaborate form of hiding. Her father's funeral had been a small affair in Missoula, attended by a handful of people she didn't know and couldn't place. The lawyer who'd handled the estate had been apologetic but firm. The cabin and its 40 acres were hers now, along with debts she couldn't afford and responsibilities she didn't want. He'd handed her a key ring and directions to a place she'd sworn never to see again, as if 20 years of avoiding something could be undone with a simple legal transfer. The drive up had taken most of the morning, winding through valleys that grew progressively narrower. until the road became little more than two tire tracks separated by weeds. Copper Ridge Valley had always been isolated, but now it seemed almost abandoned. Half the mailboxes she passed were tilted or missing entirely, and more than one driveway disappeared into overgrown brush, where homes had clearly been empty for years. The cabin itself looked like something from a fairy tale gone wrong. The roof sagged in places where snow had accumulated and melted repeatedly, and the front porch leaned at an angle that suggested the foundation had given up trying to hold everything level. But the basic structure remained sound, built from local timber by men who'd understood how to make things last. Her great-grandfather had chosen this spot well, nestled against a backdrop of pine and aspen that provided both shelter and privacy. Inside, dust covered every surface like a grey blanket, but nothing had been disturbed. The power was off, of course, and would need to be restored if she planned to stay more than a few hours. The water pump in the basement had probably seized up years ago. Small repairs that would cost money. She didn't have to fix a place she didn't want to keep. But Ash's discovery had changed something fundamental about this visit. The chest represented questions she hadn't known existed, mysteries that demanded answers before she could simply walk away and pretend this chapter of her life had closed itself. She pulled out the photograph again, studying the faces more carefully. Her parents looked to be in their late 20s, which would place this image sometime in the early years of their marriage, long before she was born. The setting appeared to be this very cabin, though younger and better maintained. She recognized the stone fireplace in the background and the distinctive knotty pine paneling her father had installed himself. The other two couples remained complete strangers. The men wore similar clothes, work shirts and sturdy pants that suggested outdoor labor rather than office jobs. The women were dressed more formally, as if they'd come from somewhere important or were heading to something special. Everyone looked prosperous enough, well-fed and confident, but there was an undercurrent of tension in their postures that suggested this gathering had been about business rather than pleasure. Beneath the photograph, she found other items that deepened the mystery rather than solving it. A small brass compass, its needle still responsive despite its age. A leather pouch containing what looked like surveying tools, calipers, a small level, instruments she couldn't identify but which clearly belonged to someone who measured things with precision. Most puzzling of all, a manila envelope sealed with red wax, her name written across it in her father's careful handwriting. The envelope felt heavy, substantial, as if it contained more than simple documents. The wax seal bore an impression she didn't recognize, some kind of symbol that looked official but wasn't familiar. Her father had used regular envelopes for every letter and card he'd ever sent her, always addressed in the same practical script that favored function over decoration. This felt different, ceremonial somehow, as if he'd known she would find it under exactly these circumstances. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent behind the western ridgeline, casting long shadows across the cabin's interior. Soon it would be dark, and she hadn't brought supplies for an overnight stay. The smart thing would be to load the chest into her truck and take it back to Denver, where she could examine its contents at leisure and decide what to do. About the property without the emotional weight of being in this place, but something about the photograph kept drawing her attention back to those unknown faces. They looked like people who belonged in this valley, who'd made lives among these mountains and intended to stay. Her parents had the same quality in this image, a rootedness she'd never seen in them during her childhood. By the time she was old enough to form memories, they'd already become people who talked about leaving, who treated their mountain home like a temporary arrangement that had lasted longer than expected. The night that drove her away had been the culmination of months of tension she'd been too young to fully understand. Arguments conducted in whispers that stopped when she entered rooms. Phone calls that ended abruptly when she came downstairs for water or snacks. Her parents moving through their daily routines like actors, who'd forgotten their lines but were determined to finish the performance anyway. She'd been 17 and convinced. She knew everything about love and betrayal. But looking back now, she realized she'd understood almost nothing about what was really happening. The fight that had sent her running into the night wasn't about the boy she'd been dating or her plans for college. It had been about something much larger, something that had required her parents to make impossible choices between protecting her and protecting something else they valued even more. Ash stirred beside her, his ears pricked toward the door. A moment later, she heard it too, the sound of an engine making its way up the rough track toward the cabin. Her truck was the only vehicle that should be on this road, but the approaching sound was different, heavier, like something built for serious work rather than highway travel. Maren closed the chest carefully and moved to the window, staying back far enough to avoid being seen from outside. A dark pickup truck, newer and much more expensive than anything she could afford, was pulling into the clearing beside her own vehicle. Two men sat in the front seat, and she could see the outline of at least one more in the back. They weren't dressed like hikers or hunters, and they certainly weren't lost tourists looking for directions. The engine shut off, and the men sat for a moment, apparently discussing something. Then the driver's door opened, and a tall man in his 60s stepped out. He wore dark clothes that looked both practical and expensive, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being in charge. His companions followed, and Maren noticed that all three carried themselves like men who expected trouble and were prepared to handle it. They were looking at her truck, clearly noting the out-of-state plates and trying to determine who might be inside the cabin. The older man gestured toward the building, and one of the younger men nodded and began walking around the perimeter, checking windows and exits like someone conducting a professional assessment. Maren's heart began beating faster as she realized this wasn't a casual visit from curious neighbors. These men had come here for a specific purpose, and their arrival so soon after her discovery of the chest couldn't be coincidence. Someone had been watching the cabin, waiting to see if anyone would return to claim whatever secrets her family had left behind. She looked down at Ash, who was no longer relaxed but alert and ready, his body tense with the kind of energy that preceded either fight or flight. Whatever was about to happen, she had the feeling that the answers she'd been seeking were about to find her, whether she was ready for them or not. The older man approached the cabin's front door with the purposeful stride of someone who expected to be welcomed, or at least not challenged. Maren watched from the window as he climbed the sagging porch steps, noting how he tested each board before putting his full weight on it. This wasn't someone unfamiliar with the property. His knock was firm, but not aggressive. 3 measured raps that suggested patience rather than urgency. When she didn't respond immediately, he waited a respectful moment before knocking again, the same pattern repeated with mechanical precision. It was the knock of someone who understood that rushing would accomplish nothing, and who had enough confidence in his eventual success to afford courtesy. "Miss Holt." His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. "I believe you might be Maren Holt. My name is Coleman Price, and I'd like to speak with you about your father." Ash remained tense beside her, but he wasn't growling, which told her something important about the man's intentions. Her dog had proven remarkably accurate at reading people's motivations, and his current alertness suggested wariness rather than immediate threat. Still, she kept her hand on his collar as she moved toward the door. "What about my father?" She called through the weathered wood, not yet ready to open it completely. "I worked with him for many years." "Miss Holt, there are some things about his passing that I believe you should understand, and some responsibilities that may have passed to you along with this property." The word responsibilities made her stomach tighten. She'd already inherited more obligations than she could handle, and the idea that there might be additional burdens waiting was almost enough to make her pack the chest and leave immediately. But something in the man's tone suggested that understanding these responsibilities might be more important than avoiding them. She opened the door, but kept the screen latched between them. Coleman Price was exactly what his voice had suggested. A man in his early 60s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His clothes were expensive but practical, and his boots showed the kind of wear that came from regular use rather than fashion. Most importantly, his eyes held the steady quality of someone who told the truth as a matter of principle. Even when it was inconvenient. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and the condolence seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. "Your father was a good man who made significant sacrifices for important work. I know this property holds difficult memories for you, but there are things hidden here that need proper stewardship." "What kind of things?" Maren found herself asking, despite her intention to remain non-committal. Price glanced back toward his companions, who had positioned themselves with clear views of the surrounding area. Their behavior suggested security rather than intimidation, but the distinction felt thin enough to make her nervous, the kind that your father spent 20 years protecting, even after he was forced to leave this place. The kind that made him enemies, who might still be interested in what's buried here. He paused, studying her face carefully. The kind that got your family driven away before, and might do it again if the wrong people learn you've returned. The weight of the chest seemed to press against her consciousness, demanding attention. Whatever was in that manila envelope was connected to this conversation, and she suspected that Coleman Price knew more about its contents than she did. "I found something," she admitted, watching his reaction carefully. "A chest, buried under the floorboards." Price's expression shifted to something between relief and concern. "Then you've already begun to understand. May I come in?" This isn't a conversation for doorsteps and open air. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the screen door and stepped aside. Price entered with the careful movements of someone who'd been in this cabin before, though he took time to orient himself to changes that 20 years had wrought. His gaze lingered on the dust-covered furniture and the cobwebs draped across familiar corners. But there was recognition in his assessment. "Your father asked me to keep an eye on this place after you left," he explained, following her toward the fireplace where the chest waited. "I've maintained the basic structure, kept the roof from collapsing entirely, made sure no one else decided to make themselves at home. But I've never disturbed anything inside, waiting for someone from the family to return. What exactly did my father do that required this kind of protection?" Price knelt beside the chest and examined its contents without touching anything. His familiarity with what he saw there confirmed that these items weren't surprises to him. Your father was a surveyor by training, but he worked for people who needed more than simple land measurements. In the late 70s and early 80s, there were concerns about mineral rights in this valley, concerns that involved both legitimate government interests and some considerably less legitimate private ones. Maren felt the pieces, beginning to form a pattern, though she couldn't yet see the complete picture. What kind of minerals? The kind that make men rich and governments nervous. Rare earth elements that are essential for military applications. Copper deposits that dwarf anything currently being mined in the state. And according to some surveys, the possibility of uranium in quantities that would interest both energy companies and people who shouldn't have access to uranium. Price stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. "Your father's job was to document what was really here, and then make sure that information stayed in the right hands." And someone disagreed with his definition of the right hands. Multiple someones, with enough money and determination to make life very difficult for anyone who stood in their way. The night your family left wasn't the end of their work. It was the beginning of a different kind of protection. Your father continued to monitor this area, continued to report on any unusual activity, continued to guard secrets that could reshape the economy of this entire region. Ash had relaxed somewhat during Price's explanation, but he remained alert, as if sensing that danger hadn't passed, but merely shifted to a different frequency. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, and the shadows were beginning to take on the deep purple quality that preceded true darkness in the mountains. "So what happens now?" Maren asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer would involve choices she didn't want to make. "Now you decide whether you're ready to inherit more than just property." The chest contains information that your father wanted you to have when you were ready for it, along with instructions about what to do if certain situations arose. One of those situations is happening right now. Price moved to the window and peered out toward the tree line, his posture suggesting he'd seen something that concerned him. My associates and I aren't the only ones who've been watching for your return. There are people who've been waiting 20 years for someone from your family to come back and lead them to what your father was protecting. What people? The kind who don't ask politely for what they want and who don't take no for an answer. The kind your father was willing to sacrifice everything to keep away from this valley. He turned back to face her, his expression grave. They'll be coming soon, probably tonight, which means you need to decide very quickly whether you're prepared to run like your family did before or stay and finish what your father started. The sealed envelope seemed to pulse with significance in her peripheral vision, demanding attention. Whatever instructions her father had left, whatever secrets he'd tried to preserve, they were about to become her responsibility, whether she wanted them or not. Outside, the first edge of darkness was beginning to creep across the valley, bringing with it the sense that time was running out for simple choices and easy answers. Maren broke the wax seal on the manila envelope with trembling fingers, aware that Coleman Price was watching her with the intensity of someone who'd waited years for this moment. Inside, she found a folded piece of heavy paper that felt like a map, along with a smaller envelope marked with her name in her father's handwriting. The map came first. She needed to understand the scope of what she was inheriting before she confronted whatever personal message he'd left. The paper unfolded into a detailed hand-drawn survey of Copper Ridge Valley and the surrounding mountain areas. Every landmark she remembered from her childhood was marked with precise accuracy, but overlaid with symbols she didn't recognize. Triangles, circles, and squares in red ink marked locations throughout the terrain, connected by dotted lines that suggested routes or relationships she couldn't yet decipher. He updated this map regularly, Price explained, pointing to areas where the ink appeared fresher than others. Every time new activity appeared in the valley, every time someone showed unusual interest in particular locations, he documented it. The symbols represent different types of sites, mineral deposits, access points, observation positions, and places where unauthorized excavation has been attempted. Maren studied the markings more carefully, beginning to recognize a pattern. The red triangles clustered around areas she knew to be particularly remote and difficult to access, while the circles followed what appeared to be natural water sources and game trails. The squares, she realized with growing unease, marked spots that were uncomfortably close to where local families lived. These squares near the houses, what do they represent? Pressure points. Places where your father suspected outside interests might try to establish footholds in the community. Offers to buy land at prices too good to refuse. Employment opportunities that would require access to sensitive areas. Marriages or relationships that seemed designed to gain local trust and information. The implications made her stomach turn. Her father hadn't just been protecting mineral resources, he'd been protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection. Families who thought they were simply living their lives in a beautiful but isolated valley, unaware that their home sat atop something valuable enough to make them targets. How many people in the valley know about this? Fewer than you might think. More than would be safe if the wrong people learned their identities. Your father was careful about who he trusted with complete information, but he needed some local allies to maintain effective surveillance. Price folded the map carefully and handed it back to her. Some of those allies have been waiting 20 years to know whether the Holt family would ever return to resume their responsibilities. Maren opened the smaller envelope and found 3 pages of her father's handwriting, dense with the kind of careful explanations he'd always used when teaching her something important. The letter began with an apology that made her throat tighten, acknowledgement that driving her away had been the hardest decision of his life, but also the only way to keep her safe until she was old enough to choose her own level of involvement. The rest of the letter outlined the scope of what he'd been protecting and why it mattered beyond simple economics. The mineral deposits in the valley weren't just valuable, they were strategically critical to national defense in ways that could shift global power balances if they fell into hostile hands. Foreign interests had been attempting to gain access for decades, using methods that ranged from legitimate business proposals to bribery, intimidation, and worse. Her father's final paragraphs were instructions rather than explanations. If she chose to accept the responsibility he was offering, there were people she needed to contact, procedures she needed to follow, and preparations she needed to make. If she chose to walk away, there were other protocols that would transfer protection duties to backup networks, though he made it clear that such networks were less comprehensive and potentially less effective than family-based stewardship. "He really thought I might want to do this," she said, looking up from the letter to find Price watching her with patient attention. "He hoped you would understand that some things are worth protecting, even when the cost is high. But he also respected your right to choose differently. The letter contains contact information for people who can take over if you decide this isn't your path." Outside, full darkness had settled over the valley, bringing with it the kind of profound quiet that only existed far from cities and highways. But within that silence, Maren began to notice sounds that didn't belong: the distant rumble of heavy vehicles, the metallic clink of equipment being unloaded, voices carrying on air that should have been empty of human conversation. Price moved to the window again and peered into the darkness, his posture confirming what she'd already begun to suspect. "They're moving faster than I expected." "We probably have an hour, maybe less, before they begin systematic searches of the area. Who exactly are they?" "Mining consortium with international backing and no particular respect for environmental laws or property rights. They've been probing the valley's defenses for months, waiting for an opportunity to move openly. Your return provided that opportunity. They assume you're here to claim whatever your father was guarding, which means they need to act before you can secure it properly." Ash had positioned himself near the door, his entire body alert and ready for action. Whatever training the dog had received before she'd found him was asserting itself now, transforming him from a pet into something more purposeful and focused. "What kind of training does my dog have?" she asked, suddenly realizing that Ash's behavior suggested preparation she'd never noticed before. Price smiled for the first time since entering the cabin. "Your father arranged for you to find him. Ash isn't just a stray you rescued. He's a working dog whose previous handler retired and needed to pass along his responsibilities. Your father thought you might need a partner if you ever returned to this place." The revelation that even her dog was part of some larger plan should have angered her, but instead it brought an odd sense of comfort. Her father had been thinking about her safety and welfare even when he couldn't be directly involved in her life. The man she'd spent 20 years resenting for driving her away had actually been working to ensure she'd have what she needed if she ever chose to return. "So what do I do now?" "First, you decide whether you're staying to fight or leaving to let others handle the situation. If you're leaving, we need to move immediately. My people can provide escort to ensure you reach safety before the consortium realizes you've gone. If you're staying, we need to begin preparing defenses and contacting the local network your father established." Maren looked around the cabin one more time, seeing it now not as a place of painful memories, but as the headquarters of an operation that had been protecting something important for decades. Her anger toward her parents was beginning to transform into something more complex: respect for sacrifices she'd been too young to understand, and pride in work that had required them to give up everything they'd wanted for their family's future. "If I stay, what happens to the people in the valley? If you stay and we succeed, they continue living their lives without ever knowing how close they came to losing everything. If you stay and we fail, they'll be dealing with industrial mining operations, environmental destruction, and the kind of economic pressure that destroys communities. If you leave and the backup networks can't hold the line, the result is the same. The choice wasn't really about her anymore, she realized. It was about whether she was willing to accept responsibility for protecting people who didn't even know they needed protection. "I need to understand what I'm protecting," Maren said, folding her father's letter carefully and placing it back in the chest. "Show me." Price nodded as if he'd expected this response, though relief flickered across his features. "There's a survey point about a mile up the ridge behind the cabin. If you're willing to make the climb in the dark, I can show you exactly what your father spent 20 years guarding." They prepared for the hike with the efficiency of people who understood that time was limited and mistakes could be costly. Price's companions provided equipment: headlamps with red filters, sturdy boots that fit surprisingly well, and backpacks containing gear she couldn't identify, but which had the weight and feel of serious tools. Ash accepted a working harness that transformed his appearance from pet to professional, complete with pouches that suggested he was expected to carry his own equipment. The trail behind the cabin was steeper than she remembered, winding through stands of pine and aspen that had grown denser in the years since her family's departure. Price moved with the confident pace of someone who'd made this journey many times, while his companions flanked their route with the kind of tactical awareness that made her increasingly certain they were former military. "How long have you been watching this place?" she asked during a brief rest beside a stream that crossed their path. "Officially, since your father asked me to take over monitoring duties. Unofficially, I was part of the original survey team that identified what's here. That was almost 30 years ago, when we were young enough to think protecting something important would be straightforward. Work, the admission that this had been going on for 3 decades. Rather than 2, made the scope of the operation suddenly clear. This wasn't a recent development or a temporary assignment. It was a long-term commitment that had shaped multiple lives across multiple generations. Her father hadn't just stumbled into this responsibility. He'd been chosen for it, trained for it, and had accepted it as a lifetime obligation. What happens to your family when you spend 30 years on something like this? Price was quiet for several steps before answering. "You learn to choose carefully what you share and what you keep to yourself. You learn to build relationships that can withstand long absences and sudden changes in plans. You learn that some kinds of service require sacrifices that people who haven't made them can't fully understand." The words carried the weight of personal experience, and Maren realized she was talking to someone who'd paid similar costs to her father. The network protecting this valley wasn't composed of faceless government agents. It was made up of people who'd chosen to dedicate their lives to something larger than personal ambition or comfort. They climbed for another 20 minutes before reaching a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a vista that took her breath away. The valley spread below them like a 3-dimensional map, marked by scattered lights from houses and the silver thread of the creek that connected the small community. But more importantly, the vantage point allowed her to see patterns in the landscape that weren't visible from ground level. "The mineral deposits follow the geological formations," Price explained, pointing to features that were clearer from this elevation. "Copper veins run along that ridge system to the north. Rare earth concentrations cluster around those exposed rock faces to the east, and the uranium signature is strongest in the area directly below us. Following the underground water systems that feed the entire valley, Maren could see why this location had been strategically chosen for monitoring. From here, a small team could observe activity throughout the region, track vehicle movements, and maintain communication with observation posts that were undoubtedly positioned at other key points around the valley's perimeter. How many people does it take to protect something like this? Fewer than you might think, if they're properly trained and well coordinated. More than we currently have available if the opposition decides to commit serious resources to acquiring what's here. Price handed her a pair of binoculars and pointed toward the valley's eastern entrance. "Take a look at what's happening down there." Through the binoculars, She could see lights moving along the main road, more vehicles than the valley usually saw in an entire week, all heading toward the general area where her cabin was located. Heavy trucks, modified for rough terrain, accompanied by smaller vehicles that had the sleek profiles of expensive SUVs. The convoy moved with the kind of organized precision that suggested military or paramilitary organization. How many people are we talking about? Based on the number of vehicles, probably 20 to 30 personnel. Enough to conduct systematic searches of every structure in the valley, with sufficient backup to handle resistance if they encounter it. Price lowered his own binoculars and studied her face in the red glow of their filtered headlamps. Still want to know what you're protecting? He led her to a metal cabinet that had been concealed among the trees, camouflaged well enough that she'd walked within feet of it without noticing. Inside, sophisticated monitoring equipment hummed quietly. Powered by solar panels, she now noticed, positioned to catch maximum sunlight during the day. Screens displayed data that Price interpreted for her, seismic readings that indicated underground activity, electromagnetic signatures that suggested metal detection equipment in use, and communication intercepts that revealed the coordination level of their opposition. They're not just looking for your father's survey data, he explained, as she listened to radio chatter being decoded in real time. They're convinced that something has already been extracted and cached somewhere in the valley. Their primary objective is to locate storage sites and determine what quantities of material might be immediately available. The implications made her stomach clench. These people weren't interested in negotiating mining rights or following legal procedures for resource extraction. They were planning to take what they wanted and worry about consequences later, which meant anyone who stood in their way would be treated as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person with rights to be respected. What about the families living here? Are they in danger? If they cooperate and provide information, probably not immediately. If they resist or claim ignorance about things the consortium believes they should know, the situation becomes much more complicated. Price began shutting down some of the monitoring equipment, preparing to move to a different location. Your father's network includes protocols for civilian evacuation if the situation deteriorates beyond a certain point. But implementing those protocols requires someone with authority to make the call. Maren understood that she was being offered that authority, along with all the life and death responsibilities it entailed. People she'd grown up with, families who'd been her neighbors and friends, were depending on decisions she was barely qualified to make. But as she looked down at the valley that had shaped her childhood, she realized that walking away wasn't actually an option she could live with. Whatever anger she'd carried toward her parents for 20 years, whatever resentment she felt about being forced into this situation, it mattered less than ensuring that good people could continue living safely in the place they called home. Back at the cabin, Maren spread her father's map across the kitchen table, while Price contacted his network through encrypted communications gear that seemed far too sophisticated for civilian use. The radio chatter they'd intercepted suggested the consortium's search teams would reach her property within hours, which meant any preparation had to happen quickly and with minimal room for error. Your father left detailed contingency plans, Price explained, as he finished his communications and joined her at the table. The question is which level of response we're implementing. Level 1 assumes we can resolve this through negotiation and legal channels. Level 3 assumes we're dealing with people who won't respect laws or property rights. What's Level 2? Level 2 assumes they're willing to use intimidation and minor violence to get what they want, but can be deterred by demonstrations of serious resistance. Based on what we're seeing tonight, I'd recommend preparing for Level 3 while hoping we can resolve things at Level 2. Maren studied the map more carefully, beginning to understand the strategic thinking behind her father's markings. The cabin's location provided access to multiple escape routes while commanding clear views of the most likely approach paths. The basement she remembered from childhood had apparently been modified into something more than simple Storage, Price had mentioned equipment, and supplies that suggested her father had been prepared for. Exactly this kind of situation. Show me what's downstairs. The basement had been transformed into what could only be described as a command center. Radio equipment lined one wall, connected to antennas she hadn't noticed among the trees outside. Maps covered another wall, these marked with even more detail than the one upstairs, including what appeared to be real-time tracking of personnel movements throughout the valley. Most surprising of all, a gun safe in the corner contained weapons that were clearly military rather than hunting equipment. Your father was authorized to maintain this level of preparedness, Price said, noting her surprise at the arsenal. The people he was protecting this from have resources that go well beyond conventional mining equipment. Sometimes deterrence requires demonstrating that resistance will be costly and well-organized. Ash had followed them downstairs and was now investigating corners with the thoroughness of someone conducting a security sweep. His behavior suggested familiarity with this space, as if he'd been trained to operate in exactly this kind of environment. Watching him work, Maren began to understand that her father's preparations had included contingencies she was only beginning to discover. There's something else, Price continued, opening a filing cabinet that revealed dozens of folders organized with military precision. Your father wasn't just documenting mineral resources. He was tracking something much more complex, a network of people and organizations that have been systematically targeting resource-rich areas throughout the western United States. He pulled out a thick folder, marked with recent dates, and spread its contents across a metal table that had clearly been designed for exactly this kind of briefing. Photographs, financial records, communication intercepts, and surveillance reports painted a picture of an operation that extended far beyond Copper Ridge Valley. They've done this before, at least a dozen times in the past 5 years, maybe more. The pattern is always similar. Identify a location with valuable resources, research the local population to find pressure points, then apply increasing levels of coercion until resistance collapses. Price pointed to photographs showing mining operations in locations that had clearly been pristine wilderness before excavation began. The difference here is that your father spent 20 years preparing to make this location too expensive for them to acquire. Maren studied the evidence, beginning to understand the scope of what she'd inherited. This wasn't just about protecting her family's property or even her immediate neighbors. It was about stopping a pattern of exploitation that had been destroying communities across multiple states, using methods that operated just outside the boundaries of what law enforcement could effectively address. Why hasn't someone stopped them before now? Because they're very good at identifying locations where local law enforcement is limited, federal oversight is minimal, and economic pressure can be applied effectively. They research communities for months before moving, learning exactly which people can be bought, intimidated, or isolated. By the time resistance organizes, they're already established enough to make removal extremely difficult. The sound of engines growing closer interrupted their conversation. Price moved to a monitoring station and activated surveillance cameras that provided views of multiple approaches to the cabin. On the screens, Maren could see vehicles positioning themselves along the access road, blocking potential escape routes while maintaining enough distance to avoid immediate confrontation. They're establishing a perimeter, Price observed, his tone remaining calm despite the obvious escalation. Classic containment pattern. They want to control who comes and goes while they conduct their initial assessment of what they're dealing with. What happens when they realize we're not going to cooperate? That depends on how much they think we know and how valuable they believe the information is. If they think we're simply inheritors who stumbled onto something we don't understand, they'll probably try financial incentives first. If they realize we're part of the protection network your father established, things will escalate much more quickly. Ash had positioned himself at the foot of the stairs, alert but not agitated. His calm suggested that whatever was happening outside was within expected parameters, at least for now. Maren found his steadiness reassuring. even as she struggled to process the reality that her quiet return to settle family business had become something resembling a military operation. "I need to understand something," she said, turning to face Price directly. "Why didn't my father just report this to federal authorities? Why handle it through private networks instead of letting official agencies deal with the threat?" Price's expression grew grim as he considered how to answer. "Because some of the people involved in these operations have connections within those official agencies. Your father tried working through proper channels early in his involvement. The results convinced him that certain information was too sensitive to trust to standard government procedures. The implication that corruption extended into federal law enforcement added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. If they couldn't rely on outside assistance, if official help might actually compromise their security, then the network her father had built represented the only reliable protection for the people and resources they were trying to safeguard. So we're on our own. We're part of a network that includes some very capable people. But yes, for immediate purposes, we're operating independently of official support systems. Your father believed that was the only way to maintain operational security against opponents who might have inside information about government activities. Outside, the sound of vehicles had stopped, replaced by the kind of purposeful quiet that suggested people moving on foot through terrain they were still learning to navigate. Price indicated that she should watch the surveillance monitors while he made final preparations for whatever was about to happen. On the screens, she could see figures moving through the trees around the cabin's perimeter, at least 6 people that she could identify, probably more positioned outside the camera's range. They moved with tactical discipline, coordinating their approach through hand signals rather than radio communication. These weren't amateur treasure hunters or opportunistic criminals. They were professionals executing a carefully planned operation. How long do we have before they make contact? Based on their current rate of movement, maybe 10 minutes. That's enough time to implement basic defensive measures and establish communication with our backup resources, but not enough to relocate to a more advantageous position. Price handed her a radio headset and showed her how to access the communication channels his network used. If things go badly here, there are people who need to know immediately so they can adjust their own security accordingly. Maren accepted the radio gear and the responsibility it represented, understanding that her decisions over the next hour would affect not just her own safety, but the security of an entire network of people who dedicated years of their lives to protecting something they believed was worth the sacrifice. The first direct contact came sooner than expected. Instead of approaching the cabin openly, someone knocked on the back door with the same measured pattern Coleman Price had used earlier. 3 firm raps, followed by a pause, then repetition. The difference was that this knock carried an undercurrent of authority that suggested the visitor expected immediate compliance rather than polite consideration. "Miss Holt." The voice was younger than Price's, with the crisp enunciation of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them followed. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests that have been monitoring activity in this valley. I'd like to discuss a proposition that could be very beneficial for everyone involved." Maren looked to Price, who was monitoring the surveillance screens with increased intensity. His expression suggested that Webb's arrival was significant beyond the simple fact of contact being established. On the monitors, she could see that the figures moving around the cabin's perimeter had shifted to more aggressive positions, ready to provide backup if their spokesman's diplomatic approach failed to achieve results. "What kind of proposition?" she called through the door, stalling for time, while Price made rapid adjustments to the communication equipment. "The kind that recognizes the value of certain resources on this property and offers fair compensation for access rights. The kind that understands your family has been through difficult times and deserves to benefit from opportunities that previous circumstances prevented you from Exploring, the careful phrasing confirmed what Price had suggested. These people had done extensive research on her family's history and were prepared to exploit whatever vulnerabilities they'd identified. They knew about the financial pressures that had driven her return, about the debts she'd inherited along with the property, about her isolation from local support systems that might have provided alternatives to whatever deal they were planning to offer. "I'm not interested in selling," she responded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I understand your hesitation, Miss Holt, but I think you should hear the terms before making any final decisions. We're prepared to offer compensation that would exceed the property's current market value by a considerable margin, enough to resolve any financial obligations you've inherited and provide security for your future." Through the surveillance monitors, she watched Webb's backup personnel taking positions that would allow them to surround the cabin completely if negotiations broke down. Their movements suggested extensive training and careful coordination. This was a team that had executed similar operations before and understood how to apply pressure effectively. "What makes you think there's anything here worth that kind of money?" she asked, genuinely curious about how much they knew and how they'd acquired their information. "Let's just say that certain geological surveys have suggested this area contains resources that could be extremely valuable to the right buyers. Your father was involved in some of that survey work, which means you may have inherited access to information that enhances the property's value significantly." The admission that they knew about her father's work meant their intelligence was more comprehensive than she'd hoped. They weren't operating on speculation or rumor. They had specific knowledge about the survey data and probably detailed understanding of what the mineral deposits contained. This conversation was less about negotiation than about confirming details they already believed they knew. Price had finished his equipment adjustments and was now monitoring multiple communication channels simultaneously. His expression suggested he was receiving information that changed the tactical situation in ways she didn't yet understand. He held up a hand, indicating she should continue stalling while he processed whatever intelligence was coming through his network. "Even if there were valuable resources here, why would I trust your assessment of what constitutes fair compensation?" "Because we've made similar arrangements with other property owners throughout the region, and those arrangements have been mutually beneficial. People who've worked with us have found that cooperation leads to outcomes that exceed what they could have achieved through independent development of their resources." The response carried an implicit threat that resistance would lead to less favorable outcomes, possibly through methods that didn't require the property owner's consent. Maren was beginning to understand that this entire conversation was a formality designed to establish plausible documentation that good faith negotiations had been attempted before more aggressive measures became necessary. Price caught her attention and pointed to information appearing on one of his monitoring screens. Radio intercepts were showing increased activity from multiple teams positioned throughout the valley. This operation was larger and more coordinated than what she could see from the cabin's immediate vicinity. They weren't just dealing with one team focused on her property. They were facing a comprehensive effort to secure the entire area. "How many other property owners are you negotiating with tonight?" she asked, hoping to gather intelligence about the operation's scope. There was a pause before Webb answered, long enough to suggest he was considering how much information to reveal. "We believe in comprehensive approaches to resource development, Miss Holt. Piecemeal arrangements rarely produce optimal results for anyone involved." The admission confirmed her worst fears. Every family in the valley was being contacted simultaneously, presented with offers they would find difficult to refuse, and pressured to make immediate decisions without time to consult with each other or seek independent advice. It was a strategy designed to prevent coordinated resistance and ensure that anyone who might consider refusing would feel isolated and outnumbered. "I need time to consider your offer. I understand that this is a significant decision, but our timeline for completing arrangements in this area is somewhat limited." Other interested parties have been monitoring the same resources, which means delay could result in complications that would be unfortunate for everyone. The statement that competitors were also interested introduced another element of pressure. Accept our terms now, or risk losing the opportunity entirely when someone else seizes control of the situation. It was a classic negotiating tactic, but one that carried real weight if the competition was as serious as Webb suggested. Price handed her a note indicating that backup resources were en route but wouldn't arrive for at least 40 minutes. Whatever happened during the immediate confrontation would need to be handled with currently available personnel and equipment. The network her father had established was responding to the crisis, but she was still essentially on her own for the next crucial period. What happens if I refuse your offer? That would be unfortunate, Miss Holt, but certainly within your rights as the property owner. Of course, it would also mean that you'd be responsible for dealing independently with the various complications that can arise when valuable resources attract attention from multiple interested parties. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Refuse our protection, and you'll be dealing with people who are considerably less reasonable than we are. Whether those other interested parties actually existed or were simply a fabrication designed to increase pressure, the message was clear that cooperation offered the only guarantee of safety. Ash had moved to a position where he could observe both the front and back entrances to the cabin, his body language suggesting he was prepared for immediate action if the situation deteriorated. His calm alertness provided reassurance that whatever training he'd received had prepared him for exactly this kind of scenario. Price's radio crackled with an encrypted transmission that made his face go pale. He listened intently, asked several terse questions, then turned to Maren with an expression that suggested everything they'd discussed was about to become infinitely more complicated. "We need to end this conversation now," he said quietly, indicating that she should step away from the door. "What I'm about to tell you changes everything about this situation, including who we can trust and what we're really protecting." Maren moved away from the back door, noting that Webb had fallen silent outside, either waiting patiently for her response or coordinating with his team for more direct action. Price led her to the basement command center, where he activated additional security measures that sealed the upper level and provided multiple layers of protection for their communication equipment. "Your father wasn't just a government contractor," Price began, his voice carrying the weight of revelations that had been held back until circumstances made complete honesty unavoidable. He was a deep-cover federal agent whose mission involved much more than protecting mineral resources. "The network we've been discussing isn't a civilian organization. It's a classified federal operation that's been running for over 30 years. The words hit her like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything she thought she understood about her family's situation. Her parents hadn't been driven away by local conflicts or business disputes. They'd been relocated as part of an ongoing federal investigation that required their cover, identities to be compromised in order to protect their real mission." "What kind of mission?" "Counterintelligence. The mineral resources are real and valuable, but they were also being used as bait to identify foreign agents and domestic collaborators who were attempting to acquire strategic materials for hostile governments. Your father's job was to document who was interested in the valley's resources and how they planned to acquire them." Price activated a secure communication terminal and began entering access codes that clearly required significant authorization levels. "The consortium that's surrounding us tonight isn't just a private mining operation. They're the primary target of an investigation that's been building evidence for decades. We've been waiting for them to commit to a large-scale operation that would justify federal intervention and arrests." Maren felt the ground shifting beneath her understanding of everything that had shaped her life. The night that drove her away hadn't been about family conflict. It had been about protecting a 17-year-old from learning information that could have compromised an active federal investigation. Her parents' apparent betrayal had actually been an act of love, designed to keep her safely ignorant of work that could have made her a target. So the chest, the maps, all of it, evidence gathering for a federal case that's about to reach its conclusion. Your return triggered the operation's final phase, partly because your inheritance of the property provided legal justification for searches and surveillance that couldn't be conducted while the land was in federal custody. Price's fingers moved rapidly across the communication terminal's keyboard, apparently coordinating with resources that were much more extensive than he'd previously indicated. The surveillance monitors showed increased activity around the cabin's perimeter, but now Maren could see that some of the figures moving through the darkness were different from Webb's team. New personnel were taking positions that suggested they were preparing to intervene rather than simply observe. And their equipment appeared to be government rather than civilian. How long have you known I was coming back? We've been monitoring the estate proceedings since your father's death. The legal requirements for property transfer meant we knew approximately when you'd be forced to deal with the inheritance, and we've been prepared to provide support when that happened. What we didn't anticipate was how quickly the consortium would move once they confirmed your presence. A new voice crackled through the radio system, older, with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding complex operations. Overwatch to all units. Target identification confirmed. Primary subjects are in position for evidence collection. Initiate containment protocols and prepare. For arrest operations, Price responded with call signs and confirmations. That made it clear he held significant rank within whatever organization was coordinating the response. His radio equipment was connecting him to a network that included federal agents, military personnel, and local law enforcement assets that had been positioned throughout the valley for exactly this confrontation. Miss Holt, the command voice continued, this is Deputy Director Sarah Chen, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your father's work has provided the foundation for what will be the largest counterintelligence operation conducted in this region in over a decade. The evidence he gathered, combined with what these suspects are demonstrating tonight, will allow us to dismantle a network that's been operating across multiple states for several years. The magnitude of what she'd stumbled into was overwhelming. A simple inheritance of family property had become the trigger point for a federal operation, involving dozens of agents and years of investigation. The anger and resentment she'd carried toward her parents was being replaced by awe at the scope of their sacrifice and the importance of what they'd been protecting. What happens now? Now, we let them incriminate themselves as thoroughly as possible before making arrests. Chen's voice explained, everything they've said and done tonight has been recorded and will provide crucial evidence about their methods and objectives. Your conversation with Webb has given us the clearest documentation we've obtained about how they approach property acquisition and what they're willing to do to overcome resistance. Through the surveillance monitors, Maren could see that Webb's team was being gradually surrounded by federal agents who had been moving into position during the extended negotiations. The consortium's personnel were skilled and well-equipped, but they were facing opposition that had been planning this confrontation for years and understood their capabilities in detail. The mineral resources, are they really as valuable as everyone claims? They're valuable enough to justify the consortium's interest, but their strategic importance has been deliberately exaggerated to make this location irresistible to the right targets. We needed them to commit significant resources and personnel to an operation large enough to justify federal intervention. Price indicated screens showing data that had been carefully crafted to suggest mineral concentrations that were impressive, but not quite as extraordinary as the consortium had been led to believe. Ash had remained calm throughout these revelations, suggesting that his training had prepared him for exactly this kind of situation. Looking at him now, Maren realized that even her relationship with her dog had been part of a larger plan designed to ensure she'd have protection and support if she ever became involved in her father's work. So what's my role in all of this? That depends on what you want it to be, Chen's voice responded. Your father hoped you might choose to continue his work, but he also ensured that you'd have the option of walking away with full protection and support for building whatever life you preferred. The choice is entirely yours. Outside, the sound of vehicles and coordinated movement suggested that the arrest operation was beginning. 20 years of investigation and preparation was culminating in a single night's work that would either validate her father's sacrifice or prove that the threat he'd devoted his life to opposing was more resilient than anyone had anticipated. The federal operation unfolded with the precision of something that had been rehearsed countless times. Through the surveillance monitors, Maren watched as agents moved into positions that had clearly been planned months in advance, each team coordinating with others to ensure that every member of the consortium would be caught with maximum evidence of their illegal activities. Your father spent years mapping every approach route, every communication dead zone, every position that would be tactically advantageous for either offense or defense, Price explained as he monitored multiple data streams simultaneously. Tonight, we're implementing plans he developed through decades of studying how these operations work and what it takes to stop them effectively. Deputy Director. Chen's voice provided updates through the radio system, describing an operation that extended far beyond Copper Ridge Valley. Similar arrests were taking place simultaneously in Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada, a coordinated strike against a network that had been operating across the western United States for years. The consortium's activities tonight had triggered the culmination of investigations that involved multiple federal agencies and international cooperation agreements. How many people are they arresting? If everything goes according to plan, over 60 individuals across 4 states, including several foreign nationals who've been operating under diplomatic cover while coordinating resource theft operations. Your father's intelligence gathering provided the foundation for understanding how extensive this network really was. Maren found herself thinking about her father in ways that 20 years of anger had prevented. The man she'd resented for driving her away from everything she loved had actually been protecting not just her, but an entire region from exploitation that would have destroyed communities and compromised national security. His work had required him to sacrifice his relationship with his only child in order to maintain cover for investigations that were too important to risk through personal considerations. The radio crackled with updates from teams positioned throughout the valley. Each local family was being contacted by federal agents who were explaining the situation and providing protection during the arrest operations. The community that had whispered about the Holt family's mysterious departure was learning that their former neighbors had been heroes rather than the subjects of scandal they'd imagined. Mrs. Patterson confirms that consortium representatives offered her family $2 million for their 40 acres, one agent reported. She says they became increasingly insistent when she asked for time to consider the offer, suggesting that delay might result in the opportunity being withdrawn permanently. Mr. and Mrs. Coleman report similar contact, with the addition of implied threats about what might happen if other interested parties learned about the valley's resources before deals could be finalized. Another voice added. The pattern was exactly what Price had described. Systematic pressure applied to vulnerable families who lacked the resources to resist professionally orchestrated intimidation. Without the federal intervention her father's work had made possible, the consortium would likely have succeeded in acquiring most of the valley through a combination of financial incentives and carefully applied coercion. Chen's voice cut through the operational chatter with an update that changed the night's significance. Analysis of intercepted communications confirms that this consortium has connections to the same foreign intelligence networks we've been tracking in relation to strategic resource acquisition programs. Tonight's operation isn't just about stopping theft. It's about disrupting a systematic effort to compromise American resource security. The scope of what her father had been protecting was larger than Maren had imagined possible. This wasn't just about preserving a mountain valley or protecting local families from exploitation. It was about preventing foreign agents from acquiring materials that could affect national defense capabilities and economic stability. Her inheritance of the cabin had triggered the final phase of a counterintelligence operation with implications that extended far beyond personal or local concerns. Price handed her a military-grade communication headset that connected her directly to the operations command center. Deputy Director Chen wants to speak with you about what happens after tonight. Chen's voice came through clearly, carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades managing complex operations. Miss Holt, your father left detailed recommendations about your potential involvement in continuing this work. The network he helped establish will need new leadership as senior personnel retire, and your family's connection to this area provides advantages that would be difficult to replicate with outside personnel. What kind of work are you talking about? Monitoring and intelligence gathering related to ongoing foreign interest in American resource sites. The people we're arresting tonight represent one network, but there are others with similar objectives and increasingly sophisticated methods. The work your father did here could serve as a model for protecting other vulnerable areas. Through the monitors, Maren could see the arrest operations beginning in earnest. Webb and his immediate team were being taken into custody with minimal resistance, though their equipment and documentation suggested they'd been prepared for the possibility of federal intervention. Other teams positioned around the valley were surrendering after brief attempts to escape through routes that federal agents had anticipated and blocked. The cabin and surrounding property would remain under your ownership, Chen continued, but would also serve as a regional headquarters for monitoring activities that might threaten resource security in this part of the country. You'd have access to training, equipment, and support that would allow you to work effectively while maintaining the kind of local connections that made your father so valuable to these operations. Ash had moved to a position beside her chair, his presence providing comfort as she contemplated decisions that would shape the rest of her life. Looking at him, she realized that accepting this responsibility would mean building the kind of partnership with him that her father had envisioned when he'd arranged for them to find each other. What if I choose not to continue the work? Then arrangements will be made to ensure your safety and provide support for whatever life you want to build elsewhere. Your father was very specific that this choice should be made without pressure or coercion. The work is important, but it requires people who choose it freely and understand its demands. One of the surveillance monitors showed federal agents discovering equipment that the consortium had been using to conduct unauthorized surveys of the valley's geological features. The sophisticated instruments suggested capabilities that went far beyond what legitimate mining operations would require, confirming that their interest in the area involved strategic intelligence gathering rather than simply commercial resource extraction. Miss Holt, Price said quietly, there's something else you should consider. Your father believed that the work of protecting places like this was becoming more important rather than less. Foreign interest in American resources is increasing, and the methods being used are becoming more sophisticated. The network we've built here could serve as a foundation for protecting other communities that are facing similar threats. The idea that her personal decision could affect the security of people she'd never met was both daunting and inspiring. Her father had chosen to dedicate his life to work that protected strangers, and now she was being offered the opportunity to continue that legacy in ways that could prevent other families from experiencing the kind of disruption and loss that had shaped her own childhood. How long do I have to decide? The immediate crisis will be resolved tonight, Chen responded, but the larger questions about ongoing security will need to be addressed within the next few weeks. There's no rush for a final decision, but we'll need to know your intentions soon enough to make alternative arrangements if you choose not to continue the work. Outside, the sounds of the arrest operation were beginning to diminish as the last of the consortium's personnel were taken into custody. 20 years of investigation and preparation were culminating in a success that validated her father's sacrifice and proved that, patient, careful work could overcome even well-funded and professionally organized threats to national security. Maren looked around the command center that her father had built, seeing it now not as evidence of paranoia or obsession, but as proof of dedication to something larger than personal comfort or convenience. The choice she was facing wasn't just about her own future. It was about whether she was willing to accept responsibility for protecting something valuable that others had spent their lives safeguarding. The weight of that responsibility was intimidating, but so was the possibility that walking away might mean abandoning work that could prevent other communities from facing the kind of systematic exploitation that had been attempted here tonight. The first sign that something was going wrong came through Price's radio intercepts rather than the official federal communications. Encrypted transmissions on frequencies the consortium had been using suggested that not all of their personnel had been accounted for, and that contingency plans were being activated that hadn't appeared in any of the intelligence the federal operation had gathered. "We have a problem," Price announced, his calm demeanor shifting to urgent focus as he analyzed data streaming across multiple monitors. "There's a secondary team that wasn't part of tonight's main operation. They've been monitoring federal communications and are implementing what appears to be a destruction protocol." Deputy Director. Jen's voice crackled through the radio with confirmation that the situation was more complex than anticipated. "All units, be advised that we have unaccounted-for personnel who may be attempting to destroy evidence or eliminate witnesses. Threat assessment has been elevated to maximum priority. Through the surveillance monitors, Maren could see new movement in areas that should have been secured. Figures were approaching the cabin from directions that the federal agents hadn't anticipated, moving with the kind of tactical precision that suggested military training rather than civilian operation. These weren't the same people who'd been conducting negotiations and property acquisition efforts. They were specialists brought in to handle situations where the primary mission had been compromised. "How many are we talking about?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be troubling. "Based on communications intercepts, probably 6 to 8 personnel with specialized equipment and authorization to use whatever force is necessary to prevent their network from being fully exposed," Price responded, while making rapid adjustments to the cabin's defensive systems. "Your father anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. But we're about to find out how effective those preparations really are." Ash had moved to a position where he could monitor both the main entrance and the basement access, his body language indicating that his training was shifting from surveillance mode to active protection. The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. This was a working dog preparing to do the job he'd been trained for. The power went out suddenly, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the emergency lighting that activated automatically in the command center. Price's equipment switched seamlessly to backup power, but the loss of main electrical service meant that some of the surveillance and communication systems were operating at reduced capacity. "They've cut the main power line," Price observed, activating manual controls that engaged additional security measures throughout the building. "Standard tactic for limiting our communication capabilities and forcing us to rely on backup systems that might be less reliable." Maren heard movement on the cabin's roof, followed by sounds that suggested someone was attempting to disable the radio antennas that connected the command center to the Federal Operations Communication Network. The attackers were systematically eliminating the cabin's technological advantages, forcing the confrontation back to basic defensive measures that relied more on human capabilities than electronic surveillance. Miss Holt. Chen's voice came through with increased urgency. Federal response teams are en route to your location, but they're approximately 15 minutes away. You'll need to maintain defensive positions until backup arrives. Price activated the final level of security measures that her father had installed, engaging systems that transformed the cabin from a comfortable family home into something resembling a fortified position. Steel shutters sealed the windows, reinforced barriers deployed across vulnerable access points, and hidden weapon storage units opened to provide access to defensive equipment. Your father designed this place to withstand exactly this kind of assault, Price explained as he handed her protective gear and weapons that were clearly military-grade. The question is whether we can hold long enough for federal backup to arrive and whether the people attacking us are willing to risk the exposure that comes with using serious force against federal agents. The first direct attack came without warning. An explosive device detonated against the cabin's front wall, though the reinforced structure absorbed most of the impact. The blast was followed immediately by small arms fire directed at the steel shutters protecting the windows, testing the strength of the defensive barriers while providing cover for additional personnel to move closer to the building. Ash responded to the attack with tactical precision that proved his training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. Instead of barking or showing agitation, he moved to a position that allowed him to monitor approaches that the building's defenders couldn't observe directly. Using skills that clearly extended far beyond normal pet behavior, they're probing our defenses methodically, Price noted as he monitored the assault through sensors that remained functional despite the power outage. Professional technique, designed to identify weak points before committing to a full-scale breach attempt. We probably have a few more minutes before they make their primary assault. Maren found herself thinking not about fear or survival, but about the generations of her family who'd faced similar moments of crisis and found the courage to protect what mattered most to them. Her father had built these defenses, hoping they'd never be needed, but also knowing that someday his daughter might need to prove herself worthy of the legacy he was offering her. The main assault began with coordinated explosions at 3 separate points around the cabin's perimeter, a tactic designed to overwhelm defensive responses by forcing attention in multiple directions simultaneously. Price had anticipated this approach, and the cabin's defensive systems responded automatically with measures that her father had spent years refining through careful study of how professional assault teams operated. Smoke deployment in 30 seconds, Price announced, activating countermeasures that filled the area around the cabin with dense cover that would interfere with the attacker's visibility while providing concealment for defensive movements. Your father's analysis suggested that most assault teams rely heavily on visual coordination, so reducing their ability to see each other should disrupt their tactical effectiveness. Maren found herself moving with confidence that surprised her, following training she didn't remember receiving, but which seemed to emerge naturally under pressure. Her body knew how to handle the weapons Price had provided, how to coordinate with Ash's defensive positioning, and how to maintain communication with the federal backup that was still several minutes away from providing direct assistance. The attacker's response to the smoke demonstrated that they were indeed professionals who'd encountered similar countermeasures before. Instead of continuing their assault blindly, they regrouped and began using equipment that suggested capabilities beyond what typical security teams would possess. Thermal imaging devices allowed them to track movement through the smoke, while specialized communication gear kept their team coordinated despite the visual interference. They're adapting faster than your father anticipated, Price observed, monitoring their movements through sensors that detected heat signatures and electronic emissions. These aren't just trained operatives, they're people who've encountered similar defensive systems before and learned how to overcome them. Ash moved to the basement's secondary exit, a concealed passage that provided access to the area behind the cabin where Price's backup personnel had been positioned. His behavior suggested he was preparing to coordinate with friendly forces rather than simply maintaining defensive positions, indicating that his training included offensive capabilities that hadn't been necessary earlier. The next phase of the assault targeted the cabin's structural supports, using shape charges designed to compromise the building's integrity rather than simply breaching its defensive barriers. The attackers had apparently decided that eliminating the entire defensive position was preferable to attempting to overcome its protective measures through conventional means. Time to implement your father's final contingency, Price announced, activating systems that Maren hadn't known existed. Hidden throughout the basement were explosive charges that could destroy the command center and all its intelligence-gathering equipment if capture became inevitable. He believed that protecting the information was more important than protecting the facility. The sound of federal helicopters approaching provided the first indication that backup was finally arriving, though the attackers responded by intensifying their assault rather than withdrawing. Their willingness to continue operations despite the arrival of federal reinforcements suggested that they considered the intelligence in the cabin valuable enough to justify extraordinary risks. Miss Holt, Deputy Director, Chen's voice crackled through the radio with maximum urgency. We need you to secure the primary intelligence files and prepare for emergency evacuation. The assault team you're facing has capabilities that exceed what we anticipated, and we can't guarantee that the cabin's defenses will hold until we can provide effective assistance. So Maren found herself moving through the command center with purpose that felt both natural and predetermined, gathering files and equipment that contained decades of her father's intelligence work. Ash coordinated her movements with tactical precision, ensuring that she remained protected while accomplishing objectives that would preserve the most critical elements of the operation her father had built. The final moments of the assault came when the attackers breached the basement's primary entrance, forcing a direct confrontation that tested every defensive measure her father had installed. Price engaged them with weapons and tactics that proved his own background extended far beyond civilian consulting, while Ash demonstrated combat capabilities that transformed him from a protective companion into an active partner in the defense. Federal agents arrived just as the situation reached its climax, providing the additional firepower needed to overwhelm attackers who'd proven more capable and determined than anyone had anticipated. The cabin's defenses had held long enough to preserve both the intelligence her father had gathered and the lives of the people he'd trusted to continue his work. In the aftermath, as emergency lighting illuminated the damage and federal personnel secured the scene, Maren realized that she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Her performance under pressure had demonstrated that she possessed both the capabilities and the commitment necessary to continue work that was larger and more important than anything she'd previously imagined herself capable of handling. 3 weeks after the night that changed everything, Maren stood in the cabin's rebuilt main room, watching contractors install the final pieces of equipment that would transform her childhood home into the regional headquarters for an operation she was still learning to understand. The damage from the assault had been repaired with improvements that made the building both more comfortable and considerably more secure than her father's original modifications had achieved. Deputy Director Chen had visited twice during the reconstruction, each time providing additional details about the scope of what Maren was inheriting and the resources that would be available to support her work. The network her father had helped establish extended across 7 western states, involving dozens of people who dedicated their careers to protecting American resources from exploitation by foreign interests. She was being offered leadership of an operation that was both larger and more sophisticated than she'd initially comprehended. The consortium we arrested was connected to operations in 12 countries, Jen had explained during her most recent visit. Your father's intelligence gathering provided the foundation for investigations that will continue for several years and will likely result in significant changes to how we monitor and protect strategic resources. The work he did here has become a model for similar operations that are being established in other vulnerable areas. The legal proceedings following the arrests had revealed the true scope of what had been attempted in Copper Ridge Valley. The consortium had been part of a systematic effort to identify and acquire control of strategic mineral deposits throughout the western United States, using methods that combined legitimate business practices with intimidation, bribery, and industrial espionage. Their operation had been more extensive and better organized than federal authorities had previously understood, making the intelligence her father had gathered even more valuable than originally anticipated. Ash had adapted to their new circumstances with the ease of someone who'd been prepared for this transition all along. His behavior around the federal personnel who now visited regularly confirmed that he'd been trained specifically for this kind of work. And his partnership with Maren had developed into something that felt both natural and professionally effective. Watching him work, she understood that her father had chosen him not just for protection, but as a partner who could help her develop the skills necessary for the responsibilities she was accepting. The local community had responded to the revelations about the Holt family's work with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment about the whispers and speculation that had followed their departure 20 years earlier. Several valley residents had approached Maren to express their appreciation for her parents' sacrifice and their hope that she would continue to protect the area that had been their home for generations. We never understood what your family was doing for us, Mrs. Patterson had said during one of these conversations. But we always knew there was something special about this place, something worth protecting. Now we know that you and your parents were the ones doing the protecting. The financial arrangements that came with accepting the federal position meant that Maren could maintain the cabin and property without the economic pressures that had originally driven her return. The work provided both purpose and security, allowing her to build a life that honored her family's legacy while creating something uniquely her own. For the first time since leaving the valley 20 years earlier, she felt like she was where she belonged. Price had accepted a permanent advisory role that would keep him connected to the operation while allowing him to reduce his direct involvement as younger personnel took over primary responsibilities. His experience and institutional knowledge made him invaluable for training new team members and maintaining connections with the broader network that her father had helped establish. Your father would be proud of how you've handled this transition, he told her during one of their planning sessions. He hoped you'd choose to continue the work, but he also wanted to ensure you understood both its importance and its demands. You've demonstrated that you have the capabilities and commitment necessary to not just maintain what he built, but to improve and expand it. The sealed room in the basement had been converted into a communication center that connected Maren to federal operations throughout the region, providing real-time intelligence about potential threats and coordination with response teams that could address situations before they reached crisis levels. The technology was more sophisticated than what her father had used, but the principles remained the same: patient observation, careful documentation, and prompt response to activities that threatened community security. Looking out the cabin's window toward the valley that had shaped her childhood, Maren could see the same mountains and forests that had provided both beauty and isolation for generations of families who'd chosen to make their lives in this remote place. But now she understood that protecting their ability to continue living here required more than simply appreciating the landscape's value. It required active vigilance against forces that would exploit both the land and the people who called it home. The chest that Ash had discovered under the floorboards sat on a shelf in the communication center, empty now of the documents and artifacts that had revealed her family's secrets. but it remained as a reminder of how much could be hidden beneath the surface of what appeared to be simple family history, and how much responsibility could be inherited along with property and possessions. As evening approached and the mountains began to cast long shadows across the valley, Maren realized that she'd finally found the peace that had eluded her for 20 years. Not the peace of forgetting painful memories, but the peace of understanding that those memories were part of a larger story about service, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of people who chose to protect things larger than their own comfort and convenience. Ash settled beside her chair with the contentment of a partner who knew their work was both important and appreciated, ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring to the mountain valley they'd chosen to call home.